Hello students, welcome to E-Pathshala. I am Prerna Trehan, Assistant Professor at GGDSD College, Punjab University, Chandigarh. In the present module, we shall be looking at 20th century Neo-Realism and its development. Throughout the international relations theory, we look at realism and liberalism as two of the most important theories helping us understand the nature of world politics. The emergence of Neo-Realism in 20th century further made the study of realist theory extremely interesting. In the present module, we shall be firstly looking at the reasons for the emergence of Neo-Realist theory. Moving on, in the first part, we shall look at the core assumptions of Neo-Realism. Next, we shall be picking up some of the most important literary works of theorists of Neo-Realism. Lastly, we shall be presenting a critical assessment of the Neo-Realist tradition. Origin of Neo-Realism as an approach of international politics. Realism has had a long history of evolution, but in general, the four generations of realism have been identified. That is, an interwar and wartime generation, best known figures for which are Niebuhr and E.H. Carr. A post-war or early Cold War generation known by Hans Morgenthal's Politics Among Nations and including prominently George Kennan and Raymond Aron. A détente generation represented by Kenneth in Theory of International Politics, including leading exponents such as Stephen Krasner and Robert Gilpin, and a post-Cold War generation led by John Mearsheimer. The theory of realism has looked, understood, and categorized differently by a range of theorists. Realism as a tradition has a long history that prevails since the time of Thomas Hobbes, Cotillard, Niccolo Machiavelli, Thucydides, Hans Morgenthau, to contemporary scholars such as Kenneth Waltz, Gilpin, and many more. Realism as a theory of international relations has widely been used and misused, understood and misunderstood, interpreted and misinterpreted, that has showed its relevance and popularity at the same time. Now the question arises, what is it that has caused the split in realism and given birth to Neo-Realism as a dominant approach of the 20th century? It is widely established that the approach of Neo-Realism originated with the publication of Kenneth Waltz's Theory of International Politics in 1979. And since then, Neo-Realism has drawn the attention of academia, statesmen, and students of international politics, which has further led to new debates on the methodology and theoretical framework of international relations, and become dominant way of thinking of world politics in post-1980 period. Besides the contribution of theory of international politics, the inherent contradiction of realism reflected or mirrored in 1970s or 80s prepared ground for the emergence of Neo-Realism. Joseph Nye Jr. argues, and I quote, "Regardless of one's normative views about the correct relationship of academia to policy, the field of international relations is not nearly as distant from influences of practical world as some scholars like to think. Therefore, it is important to be aware of the context of 1970s or 80s that caused the new progress in realism. The events and changing circumstances which challenge the application of old tradition of realism as a theory includes widespread criticism of Vietnam War, the détente for a time being mitigating the power politic and creating a breathing space for cooperation among the superpowers, as well as the growing integration of the world in terms of trade, commerce, and communication. The growth of European common market inspired Ernst Haas and Carl W. Deutsch to build a new theory of integration that focused on the role of communication in shaping understanding between the states. The Kissinger and Herman Kahn forecast of the arrival of multipolar international system further created a challenge to the credibility of classical realism. The development of regional integration, transnational actors, multilateral institutions, and the rise of economic independence further redefined the concept of security, international power, and national interest, and it further placed a serious challenge to the realist foundational belief of state-centricism, balance of power, and political determinism. Here, it is important to understand that the weight of behavioral movement on scientific determinism and changing circumstances of the 1970s or 80s made it difficult for realism to deal with new development of world politics and to set up a ground for new theorization of Neo-Realism. Core assumptions of Neo-Realism. It is important to understand the core ideas and assumptions of Neo-Realism to comprehend the preferences and beliefs of Neo-Realist approach in its study of international politics. Generally, Neo-Realism is not an entirely different from realism, but it shares some core assumptions with classical realism. Gilpin identified three assumptions which are common to all strands of realism. These are: first, the nature of international affairs is essentially conflictual. Second, the essence of social reality is the group rather than the individual, and particularly the conflict group, whether tribe, city-state, kingdom, empire, or nation-state. And thirdly, the prime human motivation in all political life is power and security. Therefore, some scholars argue that Neo-Realists shared some common assumptions of classical realism, and in one way or other, it is an extension or lineage of coherent tradition of realism that may be traced back since the time of Hobbes and Thucydides. Both classical and Neo-Realism emphasize on the centrality of state and power politics in international politics, while on the contrary, some scholars identify the distinctions between Neo-Realism and classical realism in terms of its method and scope. Neo-Realism over a period of time has evolved a new way of looking at social reality in world politics that is built on certain assumptions and in one way or the other is an extension or departure from its past. The main assumptions of Neo-Realism are the following. First, instead of unit-level analysis, the Neo-Realists focused on system-level analysis. Neo-Realism now changed this agent-centric explanation of classical realism that sets state at the center of analysis, and now argue and replace the agent-centric analysis with system-level analysis, which focuses on system as a whole or structure within which units like state, society, and individuals interact. Secondly, anarchy is a central theme of the international system. The neo-realist thinkers assumed that international politics is anarchical because of the absence of world government. Unlike classical realists, the neo-realists focus on the structure rather than on human nature as the cause of anarchy. Neo-realists believe that anarchy in international politics creates an atmosphere of fear, tension, and distrust for three main reasons. First, they place states as sovereign and autonomous units, and therefore they need to rely on their own to achieve their aims and objectives of national interest. Or in other words, states have to work under a system of self-help. Secondly, under such a condition, states are suspicious of each other's actions and behavior. The idea of security dilemma exposes the sense of insecurity and suspicion between the states, which causes arms race in international politics. Third, conflict remains at the center of international relations because states are constantly striving to improve their position in relation to others for making relative gains. Thirdly, international order as mechanistic rather than organic. Neo-realists assume that while the units in domestic orders were subjected to law, the units in international order, that is states, were at best interdependent autonomous entities. International order was thus mechanistic rather than organic. Next, the balance of power as a product of international structure, not of prudent statecraft. Realist thinkers argued that the nature and intensity of conflict between states varied under the operation of different types of polarity or distribution of power, such as unipolarity, bipolarity, and multipolarity. The neo-realists argue that the factors which affect the prospects of war and peace and balance of power are influenced by international system and not by leaders, because policies and decisions of leaders are directed and compelled by the structure. Neo-realists have generally argued that a bipolar system is more effective in restoring peace and stability as well as reducing the likelihood of war rather than a multipolar system. Next, neo-realists give preference to scientific explanation of world politics. It deals with what is rather than what ought to be. Therefore, neo-realist theory relies on positivist or scientific method to explain pattern of interaction between states. Next, state as a rational actor. States in international relations is well aware of their strategies, principles, and aims of foreign policies. It is assumed that action taken by the states is guided by rational calculation or decisions. A rational actor approach that provides models for answering the question, with what information, what would be the best decision for reaching one's goal. The assumption is that governments are unified and rational and that they want to achieve well-defined foreign policy goals. These assumptions find their expression through the works of different neo-realist scholars. Now we shall be looking at selected literary works of neo-realism. Theory of International Politics by Kenneth. The theory of international politics is an attempt to systematically understand the complex pattern of interaction between states and an effort to rejuvenate the realist thinking of international politics. Walz argues that classical realism has simplified the picture of reality of international politics by reducing an omission of fact. Classical realism has given undue importance to human nature and causes which prevail at the individual or national level in its analysis of world politics. For Walz, structure is central to the systematic approach that is defined in terms of specification of functions of differentiated units and by distribution of capabilities. He argues that only two types of structures, that is anarchic and hierarchical, are needed to describe all types of societies, including international political system. The important subject of state system transformation becomes a study of changes from only anarchic to hierarchical orders and vice versa. Walz further argues that a system transformed from one type to another type with a change in nature of anarchy and hierarchy. He argues that there is conflict, war, and anarchy in world politics not because of human nature but because of the structure. He further argues that the intensity of conflict varies in unipolar, multipolar, and bipolar structural system. The possibility of peace and stability is high in bipolar system and low in multipolar system. Walz argues that the Cold War period bipolarity was conducive to peace rather than multipolarity of the post-World War era. In short, the book gave a scientific, empirical, or logical insight on the topic of anarchy, balance of power, and power politics. The Logic of Anarchy, Neo-Realism to Structuralism by Barry Buzan, Charles Jones, and Richard Little. This work is also a significant contribution to the domain of neo-realism that tries to build a better-off theory of neo-realism. The book tries to replace the term neo-realism with structural realism. The book questioned the main assumption of Kenneth Walz's theory of international politics, that there is a single logic of anarchy. The book revised the main assumption of Walz's theory that forces at the unit level are under the impression of structure. In their main arguments, the authors argue that agency and structure are mutually constituted and relative, and therefore forces existed at the unit level that could counter the effects of the structure. It is not necessary that all states behave uniformly under the situation of stress or strain, while on the contrary, different states socialized and cooperated antithetically under the structure of international politics because functionally differentiated units coexist in a condition of anarchy. It explains that there is not a single logic of anarchy, but many. War and Change in World Politics by Robert Gilpin. This book is a significant contribution to neo-realism. It is an inquiry into the purposive role of the state in international politics and different patterns of states' behaviors. It puts forward 5 assumptions of state behavior in world politics, which are the following. First, an international system is stable if no state believes it to be profitable to attempt to change the system. Second, a state will attempt to change the international system if the expected benefits exceed the expected costs. Third, a state will seek to change the international system through territorial, political, and economic expansion until marginal costs for further change are equal or greater than the marginal benefits. Fourthly, once equilibrium between costs and benefits of further change and expansion is reached, the tendency is for the economic costs of maintaining the status quo to rise faster than the economic capacity to support the status quo. Fifthly, the disequilibrium in international system, if not resolved, then the system will be changed and a new equilibrium reflecting distribution of powers shall be established. The Tragedy of Great Power Politics by John Mearsheimer. This book is a significant contribution in the realm of realist thought after Waltz. The key theme of the book is the state and its struggle for relative power and gain under the anarchical structure of international politics. Mearsheimer explains that the power-seeking nature of the state is not because of human nature as asserted by classical realists, but because of anarchical structure of the human nature. Mearsheimer elaborates the concept of offensive realism with great enthusiasm. The idea of offensive realism emphasizes that international politics is a site for struggle of power and hegemony where states seek power aggressively and ruthlessly. The state, as a rational actor, always tries to maximize its relative advantage and power to protect its national interests and imperial goals of expansion. In The Tragedy of Great Power, Mearsheimer explains the different kinds of contribution that power and its implications have on peace, cooperation, and conflict. The patterns of power distribution expect the nature of alliance between the states. Mearsheimer argues that peace and stability are more likely in bipolar systems and less likely in balanced multipolarity and unbalanced multipolarity. Debate on the relevance of Neo-Realism, a critical assessment. The 20th century Neo-Realism set new parameters for the discipline of international politics, but it cannot be taken away as a sacrosanct theory or approach. It has been widely criticized by the scholars from the fields of political science, sociology, economics, as well as history. Mainly, many scholars argue that the advent of Neo-Realism should be treated as an extension or continuation of realism or classical realism, as it shares its assumptions and main tenets with the same. It was an effort to rescue realism from the crisis of relevance that Ashley thinks that Kenneth Waltz, Keohane, Krasner, Gilpin, Robert Tucker, George Modelski, and several other neo-realists deliberately and belatedly accepted neo-realism to rescue it from the traditional attack of behavioral revolution. Richard Ashley's article, The Poverty of Neo-Realism, generated a debate on the relevance of neo-realism. Richard Ashley argues that neo-realist approach used a modernist form of reasoning which excluded critical self-reflection. It does not give any space to thinking which challenged its propositions and method. Therefore, there is little scope of innovation and development in the neo-realist approach. Further, in another criticism, Ashley argues that neo-realism is a holistic theory which gives importance to whole of the parts. The neo-realist approach is founded on the belief that structure is more important than the individual actors or agencies. For neo-realist, structure directs and guides the behavior of the actors in international politics and not vice versa. Furthermore, the neo-realist approach is unable to comprehend the significant role of non-state actors in international politics. In his article titled The Richness of Tradition of Political Realism, Robert Gilpin replied to the criticism of Ashley. He argues that neo-realism is not a departure but an extension of classical realism. Gilpin further argues that Ashley differentiates classical realism from neo-realism by identifying the former as uneconomic and later as economic, showed flawed and superficial understanding of realist tradition. Another important critical assessment of neo-realism comes from the international society tradition. It criticized neo-realism or realism in general on two grounds. Firstly, it identified neo-realism as a narrow approach, and secondly, international society approach argues that realism has failed to accommodate dissent, perspective, or voices. Neo-Realism as an approach emerges to explain the nature of Cold War and post-Cold War period in international politics. But as new trends of post-Cold War politics cause new challenges, that is the rise of multipolar world order, increase in the number of nuclear weapons, threats posed by rogue states, and security crisis posed by the growth of terrorism and environmental crisis. In short, we can say that the approach of Neo-Realism is widely discussed and debated by theorists and practitioners of international politics and is constantly making an effort to find its dominant place in the study of international relations. It still holds the position of dominant theory of international politics. Let us now summarize whatever we have learned in the module. Firstly, it is important to take into consideration the fact that Neo-Realism, despite its stark contrasts from the classical realism, is still regarded as an extension of its past lineage, that is, of classical realism. Furthermore, the ideas of Neo-Realism presented an improvement over the classical or traditional aspects of realism, keeping in mind the evolution in the idea of international relations. Furthermore, the masterpiece work of Kenneth Walt's Theory of International Politics took into understanding the idea of structural or system-level analysis instead of individual being used as a unit of analysis for the study of international relations. The various works, including those of Waltz, Barry Buzan, etc., have contributed immensely to the furthering of the study of the realist tradition in international relations. The neo-realist tradition is extremely important in getting a well-rounded view of how the politics in today's world and in the international sphere exist. Thank you.